At that pool party, my son shoved me straight into the water and shouted, "Take a bath, you stink," while his wife's family laughed at me like I was nothing. And in that moment, soaked to my bones, I realized they thought they had broken me, but they had no idea that within an hour their laughter would turn into silence. Thank you so much for watching and for giving me your time. It means more than you know. And before I go any further, I would love to know where you are watching from. So please leave me a comment below and let me know, because sharing stories like mine is not easy, but it feels lighter when I know I am not alone. When I know someone out there understands the pain of being treated like less by the very person you gave everything to. So stay with me as I tell you what really happened that day, and how laughter can turn into regret, faster than anyone expects. I was born and raised with nothing handed to me. Every single thing I ever had, I worked for with my 2 hands. And when I became a mother, I swore that my child would not go through the same struggles I went through. So I worked long hours. I saved every penny. I gave up on my own dreams just to make sure he could have his. I stayed up at night when he was sick. I sewed his clothes when I could not afford new ones. I walked to work in the rain so he could ride the bus and never feel embarrassed among his friends. And I carried every burden silently because I thought that was what love meant. Over the years, I built a home with my own sacrifice. I took extra jobs when money ran short. I made sure the bills were always paid on time. And when he went to school, it was my hands that packed his meals, my back that bent in labor, and my prayers that followed him out the door each morning. I gave him my best, even when my best meant I had nothing left for myself. And I thought that when he grew older, he would look back and understand the value of what I gave him. But life has a way of showing you the truth in ways you wish you never had to see. He was once a boy who clung to me with trust, but as he became a man, his pride grew, and with it a distance that I never expected. He began to care more about appearances, about how others saw him, about what he could gain by standing taller than me. And though I felt it in the way his voice grew sharper, the way his eyes no longer softened when he looked at me, I kept telling myself he was only stressed, that he would come back around, that deep down he still knew how much I had given. But as the years passed, especially after he married, I saw less of my son, and more of a stranger who believed that success was his alone, forgetting the foundation I laid for him to stand upon. And yet, even with that pain pressing on my heart, I still carried love in my chest. I still baked pastries with care. I still chose my nicest dress. I still tried to walk into his world with dignity because I wanted nothing more than to be seen not as a burden, but as a mother worthy of respect. That afternoon of the pool party, I reminded myself of every good moment. I told myself maybe this time he would smile and say he was glad I came. Maybe his wife's family would welcome me. Maybe the sacrifices of my life would finally shine in their eyes. And so I arrived holding my pastries warm with hope, holding my heart steady with faith, and never once did I think that humiliation would meet me instead. When I walked through the gate that afternoon, the sun was shining bright on the water. Children were splashing in the shallow end. Music played loud from speakers, and the tables were covered in bright cloths with trays of food laid out for everyone to see. It was the kind of day that should have been filled with warmth and laughter. But the moment my feet touched the ground, I felt a chill inside me that had nothing to do with the breeze. I carried my tray of pastries carefully, the very ones I had woken up early to prepare, each one shaped with love and baked with the thought that maybe they would remind my son of the times when I would surprise him after school, when his smile came easy and his heart was still tender toward me. But as I moved closer, I could see the glances from his in-laws, eyes scanning me from head to toe, whispering behind their hands as if I were an uninvited guest who had stepped into a world too polished for someone like me. I greeted them with a soft smile, hoping my kindness would bridge the distance. Yet my son did not rise to welcome me. He did not come forward to take the pastries from my hands or to hug me the way I once dreamed he still might. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, smirked at the people around him, and let a cruel laugh slip through his lips as if my very presence was an inconvenience. I set the pastries down and straightened my dress. pretending not to notice, pretending that maybe he was only distracted. But deep down my chest tightened, because a mother knows when love has turned into something else, something cold and sharp that no longer carries gratitude. I tried to mingle quietly at the edge, to sit with dignity and let the joy of the day move around me, even if I was not part of it. But then I heard him raise his voice above the music, his words slicing through the air like a blade. He mocked me in front of them all, telling me I smelled like old soup. And before I could even process the cruelty of it, he placed his hand on my shoulder and with a shove set me tumbling into the pool. The shock of the cold water stole my breath, the pastries floating away ruined, my hair heavy against my face, my dress clinging to me as if even the fabric had betrayed me. And when I pulled myself back to the surface, it was not silence that greeted me. It was laughter, loud and merciless, rolling from the mouths of people who found amusement in my humiliation. I looked around through the blur of water in my eyes and saw his wife's family pointing and covering their mouths as though my pain was some kind of entertainment. And I saw my son standing tall, chest puffed, smiling at their approval, like he had won a prize for mocking the woman who raised him. In that instant, something inside me broke. But it was not only my dignity that cracked. It was also the illusion that I still held a place of respect in his heart, the illusion that my sacrifices meant anything to him in that moment. I pulled myself out of the pool slowly, each step heavier than the last, water dripping from me while the laughter still echoed, and I felt the sting of betrayal burn deeper than the chill of the water. I wanted to scream, I wanted to ask him how he could do this to me, how he could take every sleepless night, every meal skipped, every ounce of love I poured into him and twist it into something so ugly. But no words came, only silence. And I realized that sometimes silence can be sharper than a blade, sometimes silence can hold more power than any shout. I gathered what remained of my pastries, held my head as high as I could manage, and even though my body trembled, I walked away without a single word. Because though they thought they had won, though they believed I was broken, I carried within me a truth they had forgotten, a truth that would speak louder than their laughter before the day was done. As I walked away from that pool, dripping wet with every step, I could still hear the sound of their laughter chasing after me, each chuckle and whisper pressing harder on my heart than the water that clung to my skin. And though I kept my head lifted, inside I was breaking in ways I never thought possible. I thought about the life I had given to raise him, the hours I had bent my back, the meals I had skipped so he could eat, the clothes I had patched so he would never feel ashamed among his friends. And now here I was, treated like a joke by the very son I had sacrificed everything for. I told myself not to cry in front of them, not to give them that satisfaction, but when I reached the quiet of the parking lot, my tears fell freely, mixing with the drops of water that still ran down my face. I sat for a moment with my pastries, now ruined, and I asked myself what mistake I had made in my life to deserve such cruelty. I wondered how love could turn into mockery so easily, and whether he had forgotten that the very ground beneath his feet had been built with my hands. I remembered the nights when I held him close, when he would whisper promises of never leaving me, and how those words had once been the comfort that pushed me through hardship. But standing there drenched and humiliated, I realized those promises had long since disappeared. His wife's family had become his world, their approval his treasure, and I was no longer a mother in his eyes, but a shadow he wanted erased. Yet, as much as the pain cut through me, something else began to stir inside, something steady and strong. Because while they had laughed at me for falling, they did not know that I still held the strings to much of what they called theirs. My name was still written on papers they had never bothered to read. My sacrifices still carried weight in ways they had long forgotten. And as I wiped my tears and steadied my breath, I told myself I would not fight them with shouting. I would not lower myself to their level. I would let silence do its work. I would let truth rise in its own time, and I would let them learn that respect cannot be mocked away. I climbed into my car, the seat damp beneath me, and as I started the engine, I looked back one last time at the house, the lights glittering, the party in full swing, And I whispered to myself that an hour from now things would be different, because laughter built on cruelty never lasts. And dignity, even when broken, has a way of returning stronger than before. As I drove away from that place, the sound of their laughter still echoed in my ears. But with every mile I put between us, the sting began to change. It was no longer only the ache of humiliation, it was a quiet fire building inside me, reminding me that I was not as powerless as they believed. I thought of the papers safely tucked away in my drawer at home, the ones they had never cared to ask about, the ones that carried my signature on the lines they all ignored, and I felt my heart steady because I knew the house they flaunted, the utilities that kept their comforts running, and even the very event they were celebrating had strings tied to me. Strings they had pulled too hard without realizing who had woven them. When I reached my home, I walked inside slowly, still wet from head to toe, and I placed what remained of the ruined pastries on the counter, staring at them as if they were a symbol of all the love I had offered and all the care that had been trampled. And for a moment I allowed myself to feel the sorrow fully, to let the tears fall again, because sorrow unspoken only turns into bitterness. But when the tears stopped, I wiped my face, straightened my back, and moved toward the old desk in the corner. The one that held more than just papers. It held proof of every sacrifice, every bill paid, every foundation laid by these weary hands. I pulled open the drawer, and there it was, neat stacks of documents that bore my name, the deed to the house they called theirs, the accounts used to fund their lavish gatherings, the receipts from the event planner who had been instructed to take my calls only. And as I looked at them, I felt a calm wash over me. Not anger, not revenge in the way people often think, but a calm strength that told me I did not need to raise my voice to be heard. I only needed to move wisely. They thought I was the weak one, the burden, the embarrassment, yet it was my sacrifices that kept their world upright, and that truth was about to surface in a way they could not laugh away. I closed the drawer gently, placed my hands on it for a moment, and whispered to myself that silence would speak louder than humiliation ever could. Because sometimes the greatest answer is not in shouting, but in letting reality deliver its own lesson. And as I sat there, I knew their party would not end the way it began. For respect may be forgotten in their hearts, but power was still resting in mine. I sat there in the quiet of my home, my clothes still damp against my skin, but my mind sharper than it had been in years, and with steady hands I reached for the phone, dialing numbers that I had known for so long, people who respected me because they knew who truly paid the bills, who signed the checks, who gave the final approval. And with each calm word I spoke, arrangements began to change. The event planner, who had smiled at me many times before, agreed without hesitation when I asked that the food service be canceled. The caterers would not be arriving with the grand display they had been expecting, and the tables filled with borrowed pride would soon sit empty. I made another call, this time to the bank, a simple instruction to freeze the account that was so freely being used without acknowledgement of where the funds truly came from, and I felt no guilt as I listened to the confirmation, because respect had been withdrawn long before money was. Then came the call to the company that managed the utilities, a reminder that the payment and the contract stood in my name, and with a soft request the switch was made. The pool heater would stop humming, the water that had once been warm and inviting would turn cold and biting, just as the words that had been thrown at me. When the calls were finished, I sat back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let out a long breath, not in anger but in release, because I had not shouted, I had not cursed, I had not lowered myself to meet their cruelty. I had simply moved the pieces they had forgotten were mine to move. I thought of the house full of lights and noise, the people laughing without a care, and I knew that soon confusion would replace their joy. Questions would fill their voices, and the pride they had so carelessly displayed would crumble without me saying a single word. For the first time that day, I felt a quiet strength return to me, stronger than the sting of the water, stronger than the shame of their laughter, because I had remembered who I was, the woman who built, the woman who gave, the woman who still held the power they dismissed. And I whispered to myself that they would learn before the night was over. not through arguments or tears, but through the silence of reality setting in, and the lesson would echo far longer than their laughter ever did. Back at that house, while I sat quietly in my chair, the hours of my life stitched into those papers began to speak louder than my silence. For as the guests laughed and the music played, something shifted. The first crack in their perfect party appeared when the caterer called to say they would not be coming. Trays of food already prepared were now left behind, and I could almost picture the look on their faces when the in-laws realized the grand display they bragged about would not arrive. Confusion must have spread quickly, voices raised not in laughter but in frustration, and I imagined my son trying to brush it off, claiming he had it under control, unaware that each thread of control was slipping right through his fingers. Then came the pool, the same water they had shoved me into, the same water that had swallowed my dignity for a moment, and yet within an hour it turned against them. The heater shut down, the water turning icy, children shivering as parents pulled them out, wives clutching their arms against the sudden chill, and the very place of my humiliation became the stage of their discomfort. I knew his wife's family, proud and boastful as they were, would not take kindly to being made uncomfortable. Their whispers, once mocking me, now surely turned toward him, questioning his ability, questioning why nothing seemed to work as he promised it would. Phones began to buzz in their pockets, declined payments flashing across screens, transactions failing, and the sound of their laughter was replaced by hushed arguments, tight voices, and faces that no longer looked amused but unsettled. I could almost hear my son's voice rising, trying to defend himself, insisting it was just a mistake, that it would all be fixed. But I knew the truth he dared not admit, that everything they leaned upon, every bit of luxury they flaunted, was tied to the very woman they had ridiculed and cast aside that afternoon. I sat with my hands folded, the ruined pastries still on the counter beside me, and though I did not smile, there was a calm that spread through me, because I did not need to see their panic with my own eyes to know it was happening. I did not need to stand there to reclaim what they thought they had taken from me. My silence was enough. My patience was enough. And the weight of their own arrogance was beginning to pull them down. That hour that followed my humiliation became theirs, and the laughter that once filled the air turned into a silence so heavy it could not be ignored. As the night pressed on, and the weight of confusion spread through that house, I remained seated in my own home, calm in the quiet, knowing each choice I had made was unfolding exactly as it needed to. And though I could not see their faces, I could imagine the shift, the pride draining from them as quickly as the warmth from that pool. I thought of the in-laws who had laughed the loudest, the ones who whispered behind their hands while I stood soaked and trembling, and I could almost hear the edge in their voices now as they turned on him, demanding answers, demanding explanations, realizing the man they praised had no true hold on the life he flaunted. I pictured him pacing, sweating, his voice cracking under the pressure, as he promised to fix it all. Yet with every word the truth stood taller, that without me there was no foundation beneath his boasts. I rested my hands on the papers that lay before me on the desk, the deeds, the contracts, the bills that all carried my name, and I thought of how easily they had dismissed me, how lightly they had treated my presence, forgetting that the comforts they enjoyed had not been conjured from thin air, but carved from my years of labor. It was not revenge that held me steady in that moment. It was a sense of justice, a deep understanding that what you sow will return, that mockery cannot stand long against the quiet strength of truth. I leaned back and listened to the silence around me, a silence so different from the noise of the party, and I realized how much peace lives in knowing your worth, in not begging to be seen, in allowing dignity to do the speaking. They had thought my silence at the pool was weakness, that my refusal to shout meant defeat. But now that same silence was shaping their evening, twisting their celebration into shame, and showing them that respect withheld from a mother carries a price heavier than they ever expected to pay. And as I sat there, I felt no need to rush, no urge to confront them face to face, because I knew the truth had already entered that house, and it was working its way into their hearts, like a mirror they could not turn away from. I knew in my heart that pride would not let him stay quiet for long. And I could picture him standing there with his chest puffed out, trying to convince his wife's family that everything was under control, boasting about how he handled the bills, how he managed the accounts, how he alone kept their life so comfortable. But with each word he dug himself deeper, because the truth was slipping out in ways he could not stop. His voice may have carried authority for a moment, but when another declined payment flashed on a phone screen, when another service failed to arrive, when the cold of that pool crept through the night air, his confidence began to falter. And I knew the same people who had laughed at me were now looking at him with doubt in their eyes. I could almost see the in-laws leaning close to each other, whispering questions he could not answer, their faces souring as they began to realize he had promised them more than he could provide. And in that realization, their mockery turned into unease. The same man who had shoved his own mother into the water to win their approval was now scrambling for dignity, and I knew every false word from his mouth would crumble against the reality I had quietly set into motion. He had built his image on the illusion that he was the provider, the strong one, the man who carried it all. But illusions cannot survive when the ground beneath them is owned by someone else. I sat at my desk, hands folded, and thought about how quickly the wheel of fortune turns when built on arrogance, how easily pride collapses when tested. And I found no joy in it, only a quiet justice, because this was not about revenge but about balance being restored. They had forgotten that respect is the foundation of any family, and without it, everything else begins to sink. I thought of his voice cracking as he tried to reassure them, of his wife's family looking on with narrowed eyes, and I knew in that moment he felt what I had felt at the pool. The sting of humiliation, the weight of silence pressing harder than any words. And so I let the night carry on, knowing that the lesson was being written not by my hand, but by the truth they had all ignored. As the truth pressed harder into that night, I knew the moment of silence had finally arrived. For the music that once roared so loud had grown faint. The laughter that once echoed so sharp had disappeared. And in its place, there was nothing but murmurs and restless shifting as the party lost its shine. I could imagine the guests glancing around with disappointment, whispering about leaving early, their excitement replaced with irritation, and his wife's family no longer looking at me with ridicule because I was gone, but at him with suspicion, because the man who promised them everything could no longer deliver. The same house that had been filled with pride now trembled under the weight of doubt, and the glow of celebration dimmed into something closer to shame. I sat in my chair at home, the clock ticking softly beside me, and I thought about how quickly the world changes when respect is absent, how one careless act of cruelty can unravel even the grandest of gatherings. And I felt the stillness in my heart grow stronger. I did not need to stand there and watch. I did not need to raise my voice or demand an apology, because the silence of reality had spoken louder than I ever could. And that silence had stripped away their arrogance piece by piece. My son, who had once laughed at my expense, now stood in front of people who no longer saw him as proud, but as careless. As a man who mocked the very person who had built the ground beneath him, and who now could not hide the cracks breaking through his performance. I thought of him looking around, seeing the disappointment in their eyes, feeling the weight of questions he could not answer. And in that instant I knew he was tasting the same bitterness he had forced upon me. Humiliation in the eyes of others, isolation in the very place he thought was his kingdom. And though I felt no joy in his downfall, there was a sense of justice that washed over me, a calm understanding that what you give to others comes back. And the laughter that once pierced me now echoed against him. That hour of silence that replaced their joy was not mine to enforce. It was the natural consequence of their cruelty. And as I breathed deeply, I realized that the dignity I had carried away with me was worth more than any approval they could have given. When the night finally broke apart, and the guests began to leave with their disappointment still fresh, I knew the silence would follow him long after the last light went out, because humiliation does not vanish with the crowd, it lingers in the heart, and it lingers even louder when you know you brought it on yourself. I stayed in my home with the papers still laid before me, calm in the knowledge that they had seen a glimpse of the truth. But I also knew the real weight of that truth was waiting for him when he came to me. Because pride can only shield a man for so long before desperation forces him to face the very person he cast aside. I thought about how he might walk through my door, his voice rising in anger, accusing me of ruining his perfect evening. But deep down, he would know that the ruin came not from me, but from his own hands, the moment he chose cruelty over respect. I could already hear the words forming, the same excuses he had used all his life. Blaming circumstances, blaming others, pretending not to remember the sacrifices that had carried him. But this time, the excuses would not stand, because in his eyes, he would see the reflection of his own betrayal. And he would realize that the mother he mocked still held more power in silence than he did in all his boasting. I told myself I would not scream, I would not argue, I would not lower myself to match the anger he might bring. I would simply place before him the deeds, the accounts, the contracts, and let him read the truth with his own eyes. There is a kind of justice that does not need noise, and that night I decided to let justice sit quietly at the table between us. I imagined the moment clearly, his voice faltering as he saw the papers, his pride draining just as quickly as the laughter had drained from that party. And though it would hurt him to face it, I knew it was the only way he would learn that respect cannot be demanded through arrogance. It must be given through love. And once lost, it cannot be bought back with empty words. And so I waited, not with bitterness, not with fear, but with the calm certainty that no one can take away dignity once you choose to hold it. And in that calm I realized I had already won. Not because I had broken him, but because I had refused to let him break me. And when I think back on that day, I no longer feel the sting of the cold water or the weight of their laughter. I feel instead the strength that came from walking away with my dignity still intact, because humiliation cannot last when truth rises to the surface. And the truth was that without me, their pride had no ground to stand on. My son may never fully understand the depth of the pain he caused, but I know he will never forget the silence that followed his cruelty. And I know his in-laws will never look at him the same way again. Life has a way of teaching lessons in its own time, and that night the lesson was not mine to carry. It was his. I want to thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. It means more to me than I can say, and if my words touched your heart, then please subscribe, share this story with others, and leave me a comment below, because your support gives me the strength to keep speaking my truth.